Hello and welcome to the Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for a decade. We are recording this on Thursday, August 29th, 2024. On today's episode, a high-profile attorney who defrauded his vulnerable clients out of millions of dollars using his celebrity status and reputation to embezzle money from victims. Plus, a very young teen forced to make the adult decision to face trial for the shooting death of her mother. But first, a politician's disastrous testimony and life sentence for the murder of an investigative journalist. I am flying solo this week, so we're going to just jump right into these cases. First, out of Las Vegas, Nevada, a politician received a life sentence for the fatal stabbing of an investigative journalist whose articles cost the former public official an election. Jurors found Robert Tejas guilty of the stabbing death of a reporter, Jeff German, though Tejas proclaimed he was unequivocally innocent. Tejas' own assertions likely inflicted immeasurable damage to his defense, as the disgraced politician took the stand for nearly 3 days in a sprawling testimony that continued in a narrative form without questions from his defense attorney. Shortly after the verdict was read, the trial transitioned to the punishment phase, handing Tejas a life sentence with parole eligibility after 20 years. If we look at the evidence against Mr. Tejas in this case, I have to say, I think it was overwhelming. I mean, I tried my best to be as objective as I can and allow the juries to speak in these cases. But this case was one of those cases where it was just hard to not think that this was going to be a very quick verdict. First of all, you had the videotape evidence where you see this person in this large sun hat. Part of the sun hat is found chopped up inside of his own garage. You have the shoes that are, seen in the videotape found cut up inside of his home. You have the getaway vehicle, which is registered to his wife. And then if that wasn't enough for everybody, Tejas' DNA is found under the fingernails of the victim. That to me is about as close to a slam dunk of a case as you can get. Now, Tejas decided that he wanted to testify in this case. And this is one of those cases where you might think, you know what, as a Hail Mary, why not give it a try, see if you can't convince anyone. But this man's ego and narcissism, I really feel, was his own undoing as far as his testimony. And that you can extend that to committing the crime and the murder itself in the way that he just lived his life. But here's a person with probably the most important speech that he's ever going to give in his life. He testified in narrative form, meaning he was not being asked questions by his attorney. You see that in cases where a defendant has an opportunity to testify. They have a right to testify. Their attorney cannot prevent them from testifying, but their attorney also doesn't have to suborn perjury. So in situations like that, where the attorney might not entirely want to sign their bar card on what their client's about to say, they're going to let them testify in narrative form. So this man's essentially giving a speech to the jurors, is my point. The most important speech of his life. And he chooses to spend the vast majority of it, in my view, over kind of quibbling about personal attacks and strikes against his own ego, how he performed in his job as an administrator, why he took certain actions against certain companies, whether or not certain criticisms of him were accurate. You're on trial for murder, fella, and this is what you're going to spend your time doing. So was there a way that he could have testified, even if he wasn't the same person, in a way that could have convinced these jurors differently? Probably not, given all the evidence against him, but he certainly did not do himself any favors. And what's funny about that is that you had what I think is a slam dunk of a case that took the jurors 3 days to come to a verdict on. I thought we were going to see a verdict before the ink was dry on them printing out the verdict forms. But they took their sweet time and they were asking questions like, can we zoom in on video? So they're even going back and looking at evidence with a more critical eye. that must have been making the prosecutors pull their hairs out. So you have a situation where jurors are perhaps having questions amongst themselves, and an opportunity for that defendant to have perhaps persuaded one or two of them. All he needs is one, but he squandered that, I think, because of his own ego. I think the other thing about this is that you just never know what juries are thinking. I mean, they could have just been taking their sweet time to go through everything and never had a question in their minds about his guilt, and just felt that this was the appropriate amount of time that they needed to review the evidence. You don't know. You'll never know. You could drive yourself nuts trying to figure it out. And I've spent an entire career doing it, trying to figure out what juries are thinking. And I will tell you, I'm no closer today to having an understanding and handle on that than I was when I first began my career. The last point I'll make on this case is the idea that you see this in some jurisdictions where the jury will hand down the verdict and then immediately they go into this idea of sentencing. And it's shocking to me because I don't practice in a jurisdiction like that. I'm used to the verdict being handed out by the jury, and then weeks down the line, a judge makes a determination on sentencing. So a couple of things about this, and I don't know if you want to call them criticisms or just observations that I'm making that are troubling to me, is that one, there's very little opportunity when you have the verdict and then within hours a sentence for proper argument and reflection, I think, to be made by anyone on what a sentence should be. You're still kind of in the heat of the moment. And to immediately go from guilty to now, okay, and what does he get? It might probably tend to lean against the defendant. There's no, quote unquote, cooling off period here. The other thing, too, is to allow the jury to play a role in that, to me, is also something that troubles me, because this might be the only time that these jurors have ever served on a jury. This might be the only time they've ever been inside a courtroom, ever watched a trial in their lives. And now they're the ones to decide what is the appropriate verdict. Whereas a judge has been doing this their entire career, and they've seen the good and the bad, and they've seen all different types of cases, and they have an entire database to go back to and sift through and trying to decide what is the appropriate verdict in this case. Those are just some thoughts on it, some things that I always think about when I see these types of cases with juries deciding the sentence within moments of a verdict being handed down. But that is what did take place. And he has been sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Moving on to Los Angeles, where the greed and dishonesty of a high-profile attorney was exposed by a federal jury who convicted the lawyer on multiple charges. Tom Girardi, once one of the preeminent litigators in the country, was found guilty of 4 counts of wire fraud after the decimation of his legal empire and eventual disbarment. Jurors ruled that Girardi, who made a name for himself pursuing justice for victims who suffered at the hands of major corporations, used his prestige and reputation to take advantage of his vulnerable clients, most of whom had suffered life-altering injuries. Girardi's defense attempted to defer blame throughout the trial, placing the onus for the theft on the firm's CFO, Chris Kamen, who is facing fraud-related charges of his own. However, Girardi's actual demeanor was on full display throughout the proceedings, with prosecutors even playing voicemails of Girardi, stringing his clients along, giving various excuses to victims who had not received their payments, all the while benefiting his own financial ends. Though Girardi's prolific career included the landmark lawsuit that inspired the film Erin Brockovich, his fall from grace paints a very different picture. The now 85-year-old faces up to 80 years for the convictions and is still facing additional fraud charges in Chicago, where he's accused of embezzling around $3 million from the families of victims who died in a commercial airline crash that killed 189 people. Wow, what a fall from grace for this person. I practice in Los Angeles, and when I was coming up as an attorney, Tom Girardi was seen as the pinnacle as an attorney. He was the king of Los Angeles for a certain period of time. At one point, his firm owned an entire building near downtown Los Angeles, and it was just seen, if you wanted to become a civil litigator, this is where you're going to have to go work. This Tom Girardi is the one who rules the roost. And his fall has been absolutely spectacular. And it has changed, by the way, the repercussions and reverberations of his fall have changed the way that attorneys practice throughout California. I mean, they refer to it as Girardi rules now when it comes to how attorneys have to handle their clients' verdict winnings. And what do you do with client money? And, it's always been a rule that clients' money should be put in trust aside from operating accounts, and those money are always to be kept separately so that it's never commingled, and attorneys are never dipping into their clients' money that they're holding for them to operate their business or pay their own bills. But now the rules have really picked up, and you really have to check in on this stuff, and they're really looking over everyone's shoulder because of the conduct largely in part of Tom Girardi and the way that he ripped off so many of these victims. And it's incredibly sad because he was ripping off people who trusted him and people who had serious injuries and people who needed that money for life care to take care of their families. And they were destitute and in the worst position of their lives. And this is the person that he's stealing from. And that is incredibly sad. It's also remarkably, I would say it is uncommon, but we hear about it again and again. Michael Avenatti is a person who is serving time in large part because he did not handle his client funds properly. And I'm being very forgiving in the way I'm phrasing that. He was stealing from his clients. I mean, the same thing was going on. He's getting these large settlements. Instead of paying out the proper amount to his clients, he's just using that as his own piggy bank. And Alec Murdaugh, you remember this is the gentleman from South Carolina, the attorney who is in prison for the murder of his wife and son. But what led to all of that, according to prosecutors, was him embezzling millions upon millions from his clients in a very similar scheme to Avenatti and Girardi. And I don't know if I exactly have a point in all of this other than attorneys are put in positions of incredible trust with incredibly vulnerable people, and they should be doing the right thing. And the vast, vast, vast majority of them are, and they're working tirelessly and very hard for their clients to try to get these people back to some sort of position of being made whole again. But there's always going to be these bad actors. And unfortunately, I think it kind of exposes the sociopathic tendencies of these people that they then manifest themselves in other crimes, especially as in with Alec Murdaugh. It's funny, I've been reading a book on that case that really goes into depth of all of his dealings with his clients and the boat accident and the kid who was found dead in the middle of the road. And I don't want to get too much into all of it, but it's a fascinating story. But it all really starts to sound like this was a man whose life became unhinged after he really started to steal from his clients. So last point on this Girardi case, though, is that he is in his 80s and allegedly suffering from Alzheimer's. What kind of a sentence realistically will he receive and should he receive? And I think it raises a very interesting question about what role should age and should a person's mental health, physical health play a role in sentencing. And it really comes down to, I think, the question of what do you believe sentencing is for? Is that to remove this person from society, to protect society? Or is it to punish that person for something that they've done? Or is it a combination of both? And if you're thinking about it in a sense of punishment, well, then, people should be punished. There's an argument to be made. I'm not even saying I fully sign on to this, is that people should be punished regardless of their age. If you commit a horrible crime, the sympathy of your age should not play a role in that. But maybe it should. Again, I don't know if I present answers here as more than I present questions, but it is something that the judge is going to have to wrestle with in this case, because if we're asking ourselves what good to society are we doing by removing an 80-year-old with Alzheimer's from our amongst us, are we really protecting ourselves from anyone, or might it be better for this person to serve their time in some different type of facility, which will probably and likely be the case. All right, moving along to Rankin County, Mississippi, where a 15-year-old girl is headed to trial after rejecting a plea deal in the shooting death of her mother. Carly Gregg, charged with the murder of her mother, schoolteacher Ashley Simpson, was asked if she understood the ramifications of declining the plea and facing a jury, a monumental undertaking for even an adult. And the girl responded yes, affirming her consent to continue to trial. When the trial begins on September 16th, the teen's mental health is likely to play a pivotal role, with her defense alleging that the girl suffered from psychological issues which were complicated when she was prescribed new medications a week before the fatal shooting. Gregg's stepfather, who was also injured in the shooting, is allegedly going to testify that Gregg didn't even seem to recognize him at the time of the incident, according to Gregg's defense. The 15-year-old remains in solitary confinement ahead of trial on adult charges for the tragic death. Reportedly, the plea deal in this case was for 40 years to first-degree murder in exchange for dropping the other charges involved, with which could have exposed her to much, much more time. Is that reasonable? I will say this. In most cases, when you're dealing with a premeditated murder and the use of a weapon and an attempted murder on top of that and the other charges that were strung along, anything which is short of life, anything that we would call a determinative sentence, meaning many times you will see that somebody is sentenced to 22 life, 42 life, meaning it's an indeterminate sentence. They have to, what those figures mean is when you say 20 to life, that means that person has to serve 20 years. Then they become eligible for parole, but they are not entitled to parole. They can remain in prison for up to life if they are never granted parole every time they come up for review on parole. And we see this many, many times. Famously, Charles Manson came up for parole time and time and time again and was constantly denied parole. That's because he had a sentence that was indeterminate. He was never guaranteed parole, but he wasn't sentenced to life without parole. So there were opportunities for him to have that reviewed. So anytime you have a first-degree murder with the use of a weapon, all these other charges, anything that caps that, 40 years, meaning at 40 years or some fraction of that, depending on, good time, work time, whatever credits she may get, she will be paroled. She will be let out of prison. This is a young woman, and you would say, okay, well, then that gives her an opportunity after, yes, a very long time, but it does give her an opportunity to live a life outside of prison and to one day see, fresh air and open sky again. But you also may be thinking 40 years is a tremendous amount of time to ask of a 15-year-old for a not fully developed brain. And I agree with that as well. So taking the plea deal without considering the defendant, I think I would say that's not a bad deal for what she's charged with and what her exposure is. But when you're given a 15-year-old, I think that changes things significantly. And it begs the question of why is the prosecution doing this in this case? I am not of the mindset that a minor should never be charged as an adult. I have been doing this long enough to see many times when people who are considered minors under the age of majority, under the age of 18, have committed acts that are so heinous and so egregious and so calculated and premeditated that I think pursuing adult charges are appropriate. But at a certain point, that gets to be very young. And you wonder why, in a case like this, is the prosecution pursuing that? She doesn't have some sort of prior criminal record. If you start to ask, is she a fledgling murderer, and this is just one murder that, the beginning of a string that she would have committed had they not caught her? Or is this a young person with an undeveloped brain who is suffering from psychological issues, including perhaps the change in medication that led her to make this horrible, tragic decision? I don't know enough about the underlying facts to really weigh in fully on all of that, but I do wonder why the prosecution has decided to draw a line in the sand on this case, that they are pursuing it as an adult, and that they are making an offer like 40 years. That's an adult offer, by the way. That is not an offer, in my view, that is considering her age and psychology. That's an offer I think they would give to anyone in this circumstance. And so I'm wondering why this hill for the prosecution? Why this case? Why do they want to make an example out of her here? Now, her case is going to proceed to a hearing on whether or not the judge will even allow her to be tried as an adult. But usually the judges in these situations defer to the prosecution's purview and their ability to make these types of decisions. One last issue on this is, according to reports, one of the things she's accused of doing is wanting to show the body of her mother to a friend of hers. And that was one fact out of all of this, that, not to say all of it's not completely awful, a parade of awful, but it was one fact of all of this that really made me think, wow, this is afterwards. This is not during the time of the shooting, when you could argue she was under some sort of, temporary insanity. But this is afterwards. What does that say about this young woman? Is this the beginnings of something truly evil? Just because she happens to be a female rather than male, are we looking at this differently? Do we just not believe a 15-year-old girl could behave in a way that it is the beginning of a fledgling evil person? That was one fact that really made me take pause into this whole thing. But it's a tragic case. It's a sad case. I don't think any way this ends is going to make anybody feel good. But we will continue to watch it, because it does present a very interesting question as far as how young and under what circumstances do we continue to want to pursue adult charges against, children. But in the meantime, that is our show for this week. I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in, for making this show so special every single week. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear even more of my thoughts and coverage on more true crime cases, you can check out my brand new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And of course, you can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And we want to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments that you would like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.